problems that David Willits may be trying to address.
Sir?
It's everyone's own choice whether they take their antidepressant pill. Depression can be incredibly debilitating, but also if I want to take the risk, if I want to be happier than evolution has allowed me to be, then really that's my own decision. And I don't think anybody else can start saying, well, you need to take your sad times because in the end they're beneficial for you and they're beneficial for society, because that's taking away their right to know what's best for themselves.
Let's have a point from over here.
We talk about the experience machine as though it's suddenly some new capability, but you really don't need super-duper neuroscientists to create this machine. And obviously it's been available in various forms for hundreds of years. You know, in the time of Mill et al., there were people addicted to opium who were quite obviously indulging in it for the pleasure. We can see that across the centuries.
David Guinea, why should we let evolution dictate what our base of sadness or happiness is? I mean, there are lots of people in this room who have nipples that they don't need, thanks to evolution. Why should we let evolution rule us in this regard?
Well, I think evolution is a particularly powerful force. We can attempt to transcend it by making choices in our life, but I think it's still going to be there as a factor in determining how we are predisposed to respond.
I should come back to this argument about sadness being good for you. I don't quite understand that, because it seems to me everyone who's saying sadness is good for you are saying it's good for you because it teaches you how to be happier. But isn't the point of the experience machine that it bypasses that? You don't need the sadness, you just go straight to the happiness. You don't have to go through the trough.
So you wouldn't need this lesson in life within the machine, Joe Wolfe?
The question, I suppose, is what are we after here? If we think that evolution gives us all the answers, then that also tells you what the meaning and purpose of your life is, and that is to have as many offspring as possible. Now, it seems to me we haven't accepted that lesson from evolution. We don't think we're here just to breed and reproduce. Maybe we don't know why we are here, but it does seem to me that being happy and avoiding sadness is one of the goals that most people can rationally choose. I mean, I think it's quite important to remember where we are in the argument. Nozick and people who oppose the experience machine are not saying happiness is a bad thing. I'm sure they'd say happiness is a very good thing. What they're saying is happiness is not the only good thing, and that's why you wouldn't want to plug in permanently.
So, I've been told that my brain operates a little like the experience machine already. It protects me from the nastier parts of reality. It gives me a rosy sense of egotism. Now, that makes me think that plugging into this machine might not be such a big a deal after all, really. David Willits, should the government be making these available on the NHS?
As we were discussing that, I thought, what if we could all just go into local chemist and buy a happiness pill? And do we think that should be generally available without any restriction? And I think people would be very nervous about that. We would be on a very dangerous route to some version of the experience machine.
So is part of your job in government to make machines like this, to make drugs like that, hypotheses about them anyway, less attractive by creating more happiness beyond the machine?
Well, this goes back to what Jonathan was saying. There's happiness, but there's also well-being. Governments can't make individuals either happy or give them a sense of well-being. You can try to create the conditions in which people are more likely to flourish and where they are more likely to feel that their lives are worthwhile. And we do know some of the things about the kind of circumstances in which people do think their lives are more worthwhile. So there is some kind of role for government, but ultimately these things are individual.
And right now this role is for you as you're overseeing the government's investigations into our well-being and how to improve it. How do you measure a quality like this? Our discussion has revealed how slippery a concept it is.
Yeah, well, there's a simple way of doing it, which is being trialled in Britain, but is also being tried out across Europe and elsewhere, and that is you can go around asking people. And you can ask people, looking back on the last 24 hours, have you been happy? Have you been anxious? You can then ask a rather different sort of question, which I think is a far more significant one, which is, looking at your life as a whole, do you think it's worthwhile? And then you can start comparing this evidence that you're getting with what you know about people's circumstances? What if you found that some generations reported doing better than others? What if you found people living in certain parts of the country reported better scores? So there are various things that feed into a policy debate. People, for example, who do more volunteering seem to report higher levels of well-being. You might then have a perfectly legitimate policy debate about how do you make it easier for people to volunteer.
Joe Wolfe, do you hear the clash of Bentham and Aristotle in David's answer there, or in the literature that surrounds this research?
Well, what I see actually is a warning from David Hume, which is correlation and causation are not the same thing. It may well be that happy people volunteer rather than volunteering makes you happy. So we have very serious questions about what we can do with the evidence once we've got it. And some of the evidence is rather unintuitive. So at least in one study I read, Americans reported much higher levels of happiness than the French, which made the Americans extremely happy to know that. But I think a lot of people feel that if you had to live like an American or live like French, going home for lunch and having the whole of August off, for example, that you might choose that way. The French typically reported much more of their life was spent in something called flow, which is where you are not really thinking about how you're happy, whether you're happy or not. You're not thinking about anything. You're just concentrating. You're in the moment. You're working, or you're talking to your friends, or you're doing something that just completely absorbs you.
David Willits?
The wisest single kind of observation that I've come across in this fascinating debate was someone who warned us absolutely about the sort of self-conscious pursuit of happiness, which we know from Mill's autobiography. Mill's nervous breakdown was caused by trying to live by this utilitarian principle of the pursuit of happiness, and he escaped it after he realised it was making him miserable. And the observation is someone said, what matters is not the pursuit of happiness, but the happiness of pursuit. In other words, you're not self-consciously pursuing the game of making yourself happy. But if you are pursuing other objectives that you think are more worthwhile and significant in their own right, be it raising your kids or contributing to your neighbour or doing a worthwhile job, you then find, as a byproduct, you may be happy as well.
When you're chewing this over in cabinet, do the names of philosophers get referenced? Do bodies of philosophical thought get invoked? Do you talk about Bentham and Aristotle around that table?
I certainly think that the well-being question we think of as the kind of Aristotelian question. That's what it is. It's about whether your life is worthwhile, whether it adds up to something. And it is... so it does have... This debate does have deep philosophical roots.
Joe Wolfe, what can a government really do to make a nation happier?
Well, I agree with David Willits that if the government tries to set out with a deliberate goal of trying to make people happy, it's going to have a hard job. What it might be able to do, it was suggested, was to give people the conditions that might allow them to go out and make themselves happy. But I think there's something else. The theory of utilitarianism was criticised by many philosophers, and some philosophers came up with a different version of utilitarianism, which they called negative utilitarianism, where the point is not to maximise pleasure, but to minimise pain. Misery, anxiety, unhappiness, sadness seems to be real in a way in which for a lot of people happiness is not. And so you might turn the question upside down and say, what can the government do to identify sources of misery, anxiety, and deal with it? In what way is the government itself making people miserable or introducing anxiety in people's lives? And anyone who has dealt with any office, whether it's the welfare office, the passport office, the driving license office, will know that the government is very good at putting sources of anxiety in our ways. And so it seems to me that the government has a lot to do, and the thing to do, first of all, is to have a type of stress audit and to think about the ways in which the government itself is creating stress and can do things differently and remove it.
Very good. David Willits.
That's a very fair challenge, I think. Absolutely the kind of thing we should do. Yeah, I think we should try to make the dealing with public bodies more efficient, less hassle, more straightforward, more online. Yeah, absolutely.
Joe Wolfe, has that school of utilitarian thought had any impact upon the history of the British state? Utilitarian ideas are buried pretty deeply in our society, aren't they?
For a long time, the British civil service was full of people who had taken PPE at Oxford, and they had gone to the lectures of R.M. Hare, who was a utilitarian, and this was what they thought was the right moral theory. And if you look at how governments act, they're full of economists doing cost-benefit analysis. And cost-benefit analysis is a rather crude form of utilitarianism. It's actually worse than utilitarianism because it's not maximising happiness, it's maximising money, maximising financial value. So there is actually, I think, a deep vein of utilitarianism that runs through the British state.
David Willetts, is the welfare state an experience machine? It protects us from the cruelties and deprivations of life beyond it.
Well, throughout this evening, we've had several interventions where people have tried to take arrangements that soften life for us and say, well, it's just a version of the Nozick experience machine. But I don't accept that analogy. I do think it's worthwhile trying to help people through adversity, but that's not the same as living a completely illusory existence.
Is it your job, David Willetts, to make me richer or to make me happier? Would you rather be in a government that made everybody richer but no happier, or one that made everybody happier but no richer?
That's not the kind of framework that we're operating in. As I say, this is very much to do with creating an environment in which things become possible, in which becomes people are more likely to be able to lead worthwhile, flourishing lives. But you can't. It'd be a terrible question. And any politician who even tried to do that would be taking us down a dangerous route.
All right, well, let's put it to the electorate in this room. Bang your glasses if you'd vote for a party that made everybody richer but no happier. Nobody. And for one that made us happier but no richer. Gladys has rung her bell, which means that she wants us to sling our hooks. When this pub opened, you all objected to me plugging into the experience machine, more or less. But we seem to have discovered that these machines are more or less inside our heads, and maybe in some of the structures of the state too. I'm going to say no to Mo, the inventor of this machine, because, Bono aside, that's probably enough happiness for me. Now it's time for me to ask you to generate an illusory feeling of well-being in our guests, David Willetts, David Geeney and Joe Wolfe. As Ludwig Wittgenstein said, I don't know why we're here, but I'm pretty sure that it's not in order to enjoy ourselves. Join me to test that proposition again next week when we go once again up the Philosopher's Arms. Thank you.